guys, welcome back to Kriss Beauty. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Christina. Some of you call me Kriss, others Tina. Whatever you prefer, girl, that is fine with me. So, as you can tell by the title of today's video, I say that in every single video, I will be doing a Wet n Wild 40 palette versus the James Charles Artistry palette. This is a huge controversy in the makeup community right now. I wanted to really test if they were like dupes for each other. Now, just a disclaimer, I have filmed this video maybe 3 or 4 times because it's either my skin wasn't good, the lighting wasn't good, something was just trying to like not let me be great. So I will be filming this today. I've already touched, swatched, done all of the above. I pretty much know my opinions on it, but I want to do palette for palette. I'll be doing swatches and I will be doing the same look on each of my eye, and I'm so excited. And in today's video I will also be doing a full face of Wet n Wild. As you can see, I already have my base on. We're gonna have a lot of fun. So if you're not already subscribed to Kriss Beauty, go ahead and do so now. Go ahead and turn on your bell notifications and let's get started. Okay, so as you guys know, I already have my base on. I just figured that I would do this off of camera because it does take a little bit of time, and my routine lately has been starting off with the base for some weird reason. I like switched it back. I usually do the eyes first, but for some reason I've just been really enjoying taking time on the base and not rushing through it after I do the eyes, and then you know things are looking like patchy and funny. And so for starters, I did moisturize. For foundation, I did use the Wet n Wild Photo Focus foundation. I have used this in my last video. This is in the shade Golden Beige. I did mix it with my moisturizer to give me a little bit more of that glow, and since I've been really working on keeping my skin moisturized so that way it doesn't crack so easily, so I did use this foundation. For concealer, I did use the Photo Focus concealer, which I'll also be using again to prime my eyes. So what I pretty much have on is foundation, concealer, and powder. So for powder, I did use the Wet n Wild Photo Focus powder, which I have been honestly obsessed with. This actually replaced my Airspun. It is just so lightweight, it doesn't leave the skin too tight, and I'm just really loving this. This has officially replaced my Airspun. So I don't have on the brows. I'm just gonna jump into the eyes, but before we do that, I do want to show you guys the 2 palettes that we are going to be testing today. This right here is the Wet n Wild 40 palette, and it looks something like this. For those of you who have or have seen the James Charles palette, you know that this is looking pretty suspicious. We have the greens down here, the blues, we have the purples and the pinks, and then we have the warm tones up here and sort of the transition-y shades right here. And if we go ahead and we grab the James Charles palette, this is the James Charles X Morphe palette. I mean, this is not the same palette, literally. This is a different palette. I know they look extremely similar. So again, we have the greens down here, the purples and the pinks over here. We do have the warm tones up here and the transition-y shades in the middle. So just starting off with comparing the two, the Wet n Wild 40 palette is $19.99. I received this a few weeks ago. I purchased it on the Wet n Wild website. I also got a couple of other goodies. So this is $19.99. It does have 40 shades in it. And then the James Charles palette I got a few months back, or I got it when it launched. I'm not really sure. I don't know if they restocked it, or I believe I got it when it launched. This has 39 shades and it is $39. So just starting off, the Wet n Wild palette is cheaper, about $20 cheaper, and I got this from the Morphe website, but you can also get this from Ulta and Morphe, and I think that's about it. I do want to get into swatches really quickly because I think, I don't want to give anything away, but I feel like these palettes are super similar. They definitely have shades that are similar, but not every single shade is like match for match. Let's get into the shades that are match for match. So since I've been playing with this palette for a little while, I would say about 2 weeks, I'm pretty familiar with how or what is pretty similar in the James Charles palette. So I'm going to go in with this warm tone shade right here. By the way, the Wet n Wild palette doesn't have any shade names. So I'm going to go into this shade right here, which is like a warm tone brown shade. And this is really good for a transition shade. So this is what that warm tone shade looks like from the Wet n Wild palette. And then going into a similar shade in the James Charles palette, I'm gonna grab this shade right here. Again, as I always do, I will put up the shade names because they're just way too difficult to remember. So I'm gonna take this shade right here, which is like that brownish, sort of orangey warm tone shade. And this is what it looks like next to the Wet n Wild shade. They are definitely similar in shade. I would say the James Charles palette is a bit more pigmented, but they both do have pigment in them. Now back to the Wet n Wild palette, I am gonna touch this mauve shade right here. This is like a purpley mauve shade. Again, the pigment is not as vibrant as it should be, but it definitely is there, and it seems like it's definitely buildable. And for the James Charles palette, there is this mauve shade up here. There's also this darker mauve shade right here, or like this cranberry shade. So this one is from the James Charles palette, and this one is from the Wet n Wild palette. They are pretty similar in tone, but I would say that the James Charles palette has a little bit more red in it, and the Wet n Wild palette has a little bit more of that purple in it. Again, the pigment does win in the James Charles palette. Okay, so I do want to swatch the golds in here because there are 3 different types of golds. So there's 3 different types of golds. There's this one up here, and this is the Wet n Wild palette, by the way. I know it's kind of hard to tell. And then there's this vibrant gold, which is probably one of my favorite golds, just FYI. And then there's this more of like a copper bronzy gold right here. So I'm gonna start off with this gold because this gold is pretty similar to the one in the James Charles palette. So I'm just gonna start here, and I just want to mention that the golds in the Wet n Wild palette are definitely very buttery. So this is what the bronzy gold looks like. Very, very, very pigmented. And I'm gonna go to the James Charles palette. I would say that this gold is as close to it as we can get. Just a little bit of a observation. The one in the James Charles palette is definitely a little bit more rough, but this is what it looks like next to the Wet n Wild palette. So I would say, surprisingly, the one in the Wet n Wild palette definitely won in pigmentation in my opinion. And now just for the last 2 swatches to compare, I'm going to swatch the red in the Wet n Wild palette, which looks like this. And this is what it looks like. I would say there's good pigment in there. And now we're gonna go to this shade of red here in the James Charles palette. Wet n Wild and James Charles, I would say they're definitely different in tone. The Wet n Wild palette has a little bit more of that pinkish tone to it, and the James Charles palette definitely has that orange tone in it. And now for the ultimate test, which is this pink shade in the Wet n Wild palette. If you guys watched one of my videos, I'll put it up right here, of me testing a dupe of the James Charles palette versus an Amazon dupe, you know that the pink in the James Charles palette is unmatched. So I am going to take a clean finger, and I'm going to take the pink in the Wet n Wild palette, and I'm just going to put this right here because I'm running out of space. So clearly off of first swipe, it is definitely lacking pigmentation. Let's just start there. And we're going to go to this hot pink in the James Charles palette, which is my favorite shade in this palette. And here's what she looks like next to the Wet n Wild palette. So not only are they different in tone, I would say that the pigment is super real in the James Charles palette. Just my opinion, but you can clearly see the pigmentation is a little bit more vibrant in the James Charles palette, just starting off, but there are some really nice shimmers in the Wet n Wild palette. However, I do want to swatch some of the shimmers and some of the shades that are not in the James Charles palette that's in the Wet n Wild palette, because I'm like a little bit obsessed with it, and I think that as similar as they look, there are definitely shades that are not in the James Charles palette. So I want to swatch some of those for you guys. Back to the Wet n Wild palette, I want to start off with this gold because there isn't a vibrant gold like this in the James Charles palette, and this is one of my favorite shades in this Wet n Wild palette. Just off the bat, it's just so creamy, so soft, so buttery. So I do want to show you guys how this looks. This gold is popping. It's so hard to achieve a good gold without it being so like flaky and dry and dusty and crusty. And then moving on, there isn't a orange shimmer in the James Charles palette, but there is one in this Wet n Wild palette. I would say this orange is more of like a satiny shade more than a shimmer, but I mean, look how pigmented that is. I mean, these two shades together would be like a dream. We do have this super vibrant white shimmer shade up here that I want to swatch for you guys. You guys know I love a good white shimmer shade, especially for the inner corner and sometimes for like, you know, to highlight the face, but look at how pigmented this is. And then I do want to swatch these two shades right here. This is a purple shimmer shade and actually has a little bit of like a blue undertone. So this is what it looks like. It's definitely a little bit underwhelming in pigmentation, but I think it can be built up nicely, and it is a pretty shade. And then this pink shade that has a purple undertone is just, I would have to say this is my second favorite. The pigmentation is so good in this one. Before we get into it, I just want to put it out there. There's definitely shades in the Wet n Wild palette that aren't in the James Charles palette. So it is a little bit of like a trick on the eye, and I'll save the rest of my thoughts for the end. If you guys have watched my dupe sort of videos, you know that I like to do one side of the actual palette and then the dupe side. So I'll definitely be using different brushes on this side than this side. So since I started off with the face, I am going to add a little bit of setting powder under my eyes just in case of like fallout. Like I said, I usually start off with my eyes, so this is not like a usual step for me. So I am taking the Wet n Wild Photo Focus setting powder, which again is so bomb, and I'm gonna be using the Wet n Wild P65 brush. This is from their Pro line, and I ordered this with the palette, and I just want to say that these brushes are bomb.com. I definitely want to get the full like line. I definitely haven't bronzed yet or used any blush. So I definitely never usually put like the powder under the eyes, like I said, and I think that that's a step that you definitely have to be careful with, especially if you have like dryness under the eyes. So if you see, I didn't put it directly under my eyes, I just put it where the shadows would usually fall. So I'm just trying to get myself a little bit organized because, you know, I'm just, you know how when you clean your makeup room and you're just like, okay, hold on, let me try to keep it as intact for as long as possible. I mean, just off the bat, both of these palettes are the same freaking size. They both don't have mirrors, which is super frustrating, even though James Charles just came out with a smaller, or he's coming out with a smaller version of the James Charles palette with a mirror, so go check that out. But they are both definitely so big and so hard to hold, so please bear with me. I'm gonna try to set this up as best as possible. All right, so I'm gonna be priming my eyes with the Photo Focus concealer, and this is in the shade Light Honey. I use this under my eyes and to highlight, you know, certain areas of the face. So I'm gonna be using this on the eyes. I don't have anything on my eyes, just a little bit of foundation. I've been really loving this as like an eye primer. So I zoomed you guys on in so you can see what's about to go down. So we're gonna start off with this Wet n Wild palette. I'm definitely gonna take a transition-y shade. So I think I'm gonna take this shade right here. This is the first shade that I swatched. It's like that brown orangey shade. And I do want to stay true to the full face of Wet n Wild. So I'm going to be taking the Wet n Wild P20 fluffy sort of eye brush. And this is, again, a part of the Pro line. So I'm gonna take that shade. There definitely is fallout in this palette. And so I'm starting off of this side, and I'm going to place that shade, just pressing it right in the crease. I would say as I'm blending it back and forth, it kind of does, you know, lose that pigmentation a little bit. So I'm gonna go back into that shade, even though transition shades are just supposed to be shades that you lay down before you really go in, but I do want to build this up. So now that I built it up in my crease, I'm definitely gonna take this fluffy brush, which by the way is super bomb, and I'm just flicking it back and forth and sort of upwards. So this is what the Wet n Wild side is looking like so far. So now I'm gonna take a different fluffy brush, and this is just a regular little fluffy brush. So I'm gonna go into the James Charles palette, and we're gonna grab this shade right here, and just like the Wet n Wild side, I'm going to place that in the crease. Oh, This is why we put setting powder, because I just made a mistake. Okay, so right off the bat, the pigmentation is snatching my edges and my whole existence. I would say with this shade as well, it does turn into like that pinkish tone. Okay, so I haven't picked this up for a second time. I'm literally just shading it out. I'm gonna take literally the smallest amount because I want to build it up the outer corner of the outer V. Okay, so I would say that both sides definitely blend out almost identical. This is just a transition shade, so we're gonna move on to like some real pigment. I actually know what I want to do as far as the eyes, so that's exciting. So I want to take this mauve shade right here. I'm going to take a little bit more of a precise brush. This is the P15 brush from the Pro line, and I'm going to take this mauve shade right here. I want to build up my crease color. Since this turned into like a pinkish sort of tone, I definitely want to keep in tone with that. So I want to keep it just like that. I'm gonna take the Morphe M433 brush, which is sort of like that fluffy but more precise brush, and I'm going to go into the mauve shade in the James Charles palette. Alright you guys, so now it's time to actually cut the crease. You guys know I love cutting the crease. So I'm going to take two different concealer brushes. So for the Wet n Wild side, I'm going to take this Wet n Wild concealer brush. This is not from the Pro line, this is just the regular Wet n Wild line of brushes. And I have to say this is not my favorite. It is a little bit flimsy, but it does get the job done. So I'm going to take my Wet n Wild concealer again, and I'm going to begin to cut the crease on this side. Okay, so I cut the crease on this side. If you notice, I didn't cut it all the way to the end. I definitely left an open space here. So I went about maybe 85% of the way. And now for the other side, I'm going to use the Morphe M421 brush, which is also a small concealer brush. It's one of my favorite brushes to use. We're gonna move on to another shade in both of these palettes, and I'm super excited about them because they are the purples. So there's this purple in the Wet n Wild palette. I have to admit, I love this purple shade more than the shade, not the actual pigment. I'm talking about the shade, like the color of it, more than the James Charles palette. So I'm just gonna take this purple shade really quickly, and here's what she looks like in the Wet n Wild palette. Super pretty. In the James Charles palette, there's the purple shade that is closest to that is this purple shade, which as you can see is a little bit more like pale in comparison. But this is what she looks like. They're both pretty similar. I would say the pigmentation, surprisingly, in the Wet n Wild is actually a little bit more pigmented. So I'm gonna use those purples, I'm gonna use the magentas, and I'm just super excited. So I am gonna start off with the magenta in the Wet n Wild palette, which looks like this. She is super pigmented, really nice. And we're gonna close these areas in the eyes. So I'm gonna take that magenta shade again with the more precise brush. And then we're gonna go into the magenta shade in the James Charles palette, which I have to say is a little bit more vibrant, and that's this shade right here. And we're doing the same thing that we did on the other side, which is stamping it right in the outer V and sort of shading it in to the cut crease. I would say that there's definitely a different tone. This magenta is a little bit more pink, a little bit more vibrant, and it's definitely easier to blend. Okay, so just to match this James Charles side, I am going to go one more time in with the Wet n Wild side and just sort of build up that pigment just one more time. And it's definitely a little bit more deeper and purple, and it's not as easy to blend as the other magenta in the James Charles palette. And I guess it doesn't matter because I'm going to put some purple on top, but it would matter if you're just going to use this by itself, and you shouldn't have to like grab other shades to make up in that pigment. Just saying. So I am going to go into that purple in the Wet n Wild palette again, which is this beautiful vibrant shade. And for the purple in the James Charles palette, which I showed earlier, I'm going to grab the Morphe M433 brush again, highly pigmented. So even though it doesn't seem as vibrant in the actual palette, it's definitely just as vibrant as this purple, if not more. I would say the Wet n Wild side is looking a little bit deeper. I do want to place a little bit of a deeper shade in the James Charles side just so I can match both sides, but I'm definitely having a better time blending with the James Charles side. So I'm going to take the deeper purple in the James Charles palette. I'm just going to deepen up this corner just a little bit. Okay, so this is what both sides are looking like. I do want to save my final thoughts to the end. The overall looks of these, of both of the eyes, are actually really nice. So there is a matte white shade in the Wet n Wild palette as well as the James Charles palette. So I want to take both white shades, see which shade is a little bit more pigmented. So I'm going to take this stark white shade in the Wet n Wild palette, and I kind of want to place this down right directly on the cut crease. And I have to say the white shade in this Wet n Wild palette is super, like, really pigmented. Okay, so that's the white in the Wet n Wild palette, and I'm actually really loving it. Like, really, it's really scary. I'm gonna take this white in the James Charles palette, and a lot of pigment comes up as well. Okay, so I would say that the white in the James Charles palette is just as nice. I find myself having to pick up and really dig into it though, which I really didn't have to do with the Wet n Wild palette, like, at all. So because I have to build up the pigment for the James Charles side and like really keep digging and trying to build up this side, it's becoming a little bit like patchy. I don't really know if you guys could see that, but it's like cracking a little bit. It's not my favorite white. I would say that the white in the Wet n Wild palette is definitely just better in pigmentation. I'm just shading in the white with the purple. So for this next step, I do want to take the Wet n Wild P10 brush, which is sort of like this really dense small pencil brush. So I'm going to take the purple again in the Wet n Wild side, and I do want to stamp this along the lash line. And then I want to take this black in the Wet n Wild side. So I went ahead and I cleaned off the pencil brush from Wet n Wild because I want to use it for the James Charles side as well. So I am going to take that purple from the James Charles side. Okay, so I did go ahead and finish up the very top lash line of my eyes. Again, dipping into the James Charles palette, using the purple and the black to sort of create like a smoky effect. I added some lashes that are from Amazon, so they're not from Wet n Wild, so that kind of breaks the rules a little bit.
Wow. Wow. Capital W-O-W. WTF. OMG.
And then I added brows as well, which isn't from Wet n Wild either, just because they don't have really good lashes. I'm not a big fan of the brow products, but I will link everything that I used on and off of camera down below. So now that the lashes are on, I do want to do the lower lash line before we get into, no, actually I changed my mind. I'm gonna do the face. Okay, so for contouring, of course, I'm gonna use the Wet n Wild contouring palette, and this is in the shade Dulce de Leche. And lately I've been going a little bit more precise with my contour, so I'm gonna be using this brush from the Pro line. I'm gonna keep this right where my contour is supposed to be, right along the cheekbones, and I sort of like to flicker it up so it gives me more of that like chiseled effect. And this is really good for like chiseling out the jaw, or where you want the jawline to be. I know the contour seems a little bit harsh, but once we put the blush on and then we spray the face again, it all sort of like melts together. You don't want a harsh line for some weird reason. You can take the lighter shade in this and sort of use that to like blend this in. Okay, so for blush, I'm going to be using the Wet n Wild Color Icon blush. I used this in one of my videos, I believe it was like 2 videos ago, but it was in the shade Mellow Wine, and it was a little bit dark. So I got the shade Keep It Peachy, which is a really beautiful peach. So I'm going to use this shade with the Wet n Wild. This is like a blush brush, but it's a little bit angled, and it's just a really nice peachy shade. And then now we're going to do the lower lash line. We're gonna highlight and all that fun stuff. So I'm gonna take the 2 palettes again, and I'm gonna basically be using the same purple and mauve tones just to sort of create that nice little smoky effect. Okay, so we are pretty much done with the eyes. I do want to add some mascara, so I'm going to take the Wet n Wild Max Volume Mascara. Okay, and now for highlight, I am going to go into one of my favorite highlights of all freaking time. I'm going to use the Wet n Wild Mega Glow Highlighting Powder in the shade Blossom Glow. It is a really pretty pinky sort of shade, champagne shade. It is like one of the best highlighters that I have. So I am going to be using something that I don't usually use, which is a highlighting fan brush from Wet n Wild. It is like a very flimsy sort of brush, but it does get the job done. And I'm just gonna use this right above my, woof, honey. Okay, and before we do lips, I do want to spray down my face one more time with the Rose Water 3-in-1 Primer Spray. I use this off of camera, and I really love this Rose Water Spray. This is a 3-in-1 Primer Spray, so it preps, sets, and refreshes. It has a really beautiful light rose scent, and I just love it. And then I'm going to place that highlighter shade right in my inner corners. And now lastly, we are going to do lips before I give you my final thoughts. So I'm going to be grabbing 2 of my favorite like lip combos. This is the Wet n Wild Gel Lip Liner in the shade Bear to Comment. My absolutely favorite shade is Bear to Comment. It's like a nice little nudie lip vibe. And then I'm going to take my favorite lip gloss, which is the Wet n Wild Libra Lip Gloss. So I lined the perimeter of my lips and a little bit on the inside. And then before we put on the gloss, I do want to put on this Wet n Wild gel liner in the shade. This is in the shade Sand News. It is a super light peachy shade. Okay, and this is the final look. I am just totally obsessed with this look. I think that the eye looks look really similar. I love everything about the skin, the lips, everything is just really working in my favor today, and I love it. So let's talk about the palettes. So let's just get down to it. Both palettes are amazing. Let's talk about price point. The Wet n Wild palette is $19. The James Charles palette is $39. There's a $20 difference. Same size. You get one more shade in the Wet n Wild palette. They're the same size. The Wet n Wild packaging is a little bit more creative, and I definitely wanted to dip into it just based on the packaging. But the James Charles palette is, I think the packaging is really nice here too. More simple, more sleek. That's packaging, that's price point. Let's talk about blendability. We're gonna talk about pigmentation. So as far as blendability, I feel like the blendability of the Wet n Wild 40 palette is definitely a little bit more better. You do have a little bit more of consistency in blendability. I feel like with the James Charles palette, like there can be a shade that you can blend like a dream, and then the other shades, they're pressed a little bit harder, so it's a little bit harder to blend. So I just feel like the Wet n Wild palette is a little bit more consistent. But as far as pigmentation, I feel like the James Charles palette just delivers way more consistently. Now, don't get me wrong, there are some shades in the James Charles palette that are not consistently pigmented, but I feel like 9 out of 10 times the pigmentation is there. In the Wet n Wild palette, it is lacking a little bit more in pigmentation. They are pigmented, but as pigmented as the James Charles palette, I don't think so. I feel like they can be definitely built up and just as pigmented, but it is after 2 or 3 times of building and blending and really getting it there. And I think the last point that I want to make is presentation. I think that although these palettes are similar, I think that the way Wet n Wild went about presenting the palette was super shady. It was just competitive, it was combative, it was just coming for the James Charles palette. They knew exactly what they were doing as far as marketing, and it worked because people went crazy. There was definitely a way to present this. I think that they could have definitely came out with the palette maybe in 2 or 3 palettes, because it is a huge, there's just so many shades, and I think that they didn't even try to switch up the color scheme. I think that it was super intentional and just super disrespectful to the James Charles palette, and it was a slap in the face, whether it was a trick on the eye or not, because like I said, there are shades in here that aren't in the James Charles palette, so I don't respect them for that at all. I think that the shades really held up really well, but I think that the competition of the James Charles palette and being so like shady with that, it really did overshine how well this palette is. I think that if they would have came out with it just on their own and just said, here, this is our palette and this is what it is, I think that it would have been, I would have respected it more, really. But I just think that it's an amazing palette on its own. I feel like it definitely shouldn't have been in comparison to the James Charles palette. 1, because it's just not cool to do that, but 2, because the pigmentation is what everybody's really looking for. The James Charles palette is super pigmented, and when you think about the James Charles palette, you think about how pigmented and beautiful and big and bright it is, and yet you have the presentation, it's big and bright, but the pigmentation is not, it comes close to the James Charles palette, but it's not there. I think you should have just never came for the queen, really. I think it would have been great if this came out on its own. It had its own 2 feet to stand on, and not the James Charles Morphe palette to stand on. But that's just my personal opinion. As far as being a dupe, I would say there's shades in there that are definitely a dupe. It's not exact dupe for dupe, so I really wish that they would have came out with this just a little bit differently. I would say just giving it a number, a grade, 1 being it's like not even close, and 10 being it is the exact shade for shade match for the James Charles palette. I would say maybe it's a 7.5 and 8, and that's just based on placement and packaging and blendability and things like that. Those are my final thoughts. I love both palettes. I will definitely continue to use both palettes. I love every single product that I use today. I love Wet n Wild in general. So that wraps up today's video. I hope you guys guys enjoyed today's video. I hope you enjoyed the look, a lot of the talking part, and I want to know which palette you prefer down in the comments below, so just let me know. And also make sure that you're subscribed to Kriss Beauty, that you turn on your bell notifications so that way you don't miss out on videos like this. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you guys next time. Bye guys.